The discovery. The sun blazed mercilessly over the Egyptian desert. The air shimmered with heat as the team of archaeologists worked tirelessly under the golden sands. Among them was Dr. James Carter, a seasoned archaeologist known for his uncanny ability to find the impossible. For months, his team had been excavating an ancient site, one that locals whispered about with unease. They called it the Cursed Tomb. It was late in the afternoon when the breakthrough happened. A young assistant, Emma, stumbled across a peculiar stone slab buried under layers of sand. It was unlike anything they had ever seen, covered in intricate carvings that didn't match any known Egyptian style. Strange symbols spiraled across its surface, glowing faintly under the harsh sunlight. The team gathered, excitement mingling with unease. "This isn't Egyptian," James murmured, brushing his fingers across the carvings. The texture was oddly smooth, almost metallic, as if it didn't belong to this world. As the team carefully unearthed the stone slab, they discovered a hidden chamber beneath. It was a small, square room, sealed perfectly for what seemed like millennia. Inside, they found her, a mummy lying in an ornate sarcophagus that looked more like a machine than a coffin. It was crafted from material that shimmered with an otherworldly glow, as though it were alive. "Is this even real?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and fear. James, however, was fascinated. This is beyond anything we've ever found. Document everything. Don't touch anything yet." The team set up cameras and lights, their movements slow and deliberate. Despite the excitement, a heavy sense of dread hung in the air. Something about the room felt wrong. The temperature had dropped significantly, and a strange hum filled the chamber, like a faint vibration in their bones. As James studied the sarcophagus, he noticed symbols similar to the ones on the stone slab outside. They seemed to depict a story, one of a great civilization, a war, and something that looked like a warning. "What do you think it says?" Emma asked, standing beside him. James shook his head. "I don't know, but it feels like it's trying to tell us something important." Against his better judgment, James decided to open the sarcophagus. The team watched in tense silence as he and two others slowly pried it open. The lid was surprisingly light, almost as if it wanted to be lifted. Inside lay the mummy, perfectly preserved. She was unlike any other mummy James had ever seen. Her skin was smooth and intact, with a faint golden hue that shimmered under the lights. Her eyes were closed, her face serene, and her hands rested on her chest, clutching the strange crystal orb. "What kind of preservation is this?" one of the assistants murmured. James leaned closer, examining the orb. It seemed to pulse faintly, as if it were alive. "This is not human," he said finally. Before anyone could respond, the lights flickered. The hum in the room grew louder, resonating through their bodies. The ground beneath them trembled slightly. Emma gasped as the air grew colder, and a faint whisper echoed in the chamber. "Did anyone else hear that?" she asked, her voice shaking. James nodded, his heart pounding. Everyone stepped back, but it was too late. As James backed away, his hand brushed against the mummy's arm. It was a brief touch, but it sent a jolt through his body, like an electric shock. He stumbled back, his vision blurring for a moment. The whisper grew louder, now forming words in a language none of them recognized. The air crackled with energy, and the mummy's eyes shot open. They weren't human eyes. They glowed with an eerie green light, piercing and otherworldly. The entire team froze in terror as the mummy slowly turned her head, her gaze locking onto James. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the hum, now deafening. Then, in a voice that was both soft and commanding, the mummy spoke. "You should not have woken me," she said, her words clear and precise. The team broke into chaos. Some screamed, others ran. But James couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, staring at the impossible sight before him. The mummy sat up slowly, the orb in her hands glowing brighter. "What are you?" James managed to whisper. The mummy tilted her head, her glowing eyes narrowing. I am your salvation, or your doom. Before James could process her words, the lights in the chamber exploded, plunging them into darkness. The last thing he saw was the green glow of her eyes, illuminating the terrified faces of his team. The hum stopped, leaving an eerie silence. When the backup lights flickered on, the mummy was standing, her presence commanding and terrifying. She looked at James and said, "Your world is not ready for what's coming." James knew in that moment that their discovery wasn't just an archaeological breakthrough. It was a warning, and they had just unleashed something far beyond their understanding. Awakening the unknown. The camp was in chaos. News of the mummy's awakening had spread like wildfire among the team. Some packed their belongings, muttering about curses and bad omens, while others clung to the edges of the chamber, their curiosity outweighing their fear. Dr. James Carter, however, couldn't think of anything else but her, the creature, the being that now stood in the center of the chamber, radiating an unearthly presence. She wasn't just a preserved body. She was alive. The glow in her eyes dimmed slightly as she scanned the room, her movements fluid, almost graceful. She studied the team, her expression unreadable. James felt a strange pull toward her, as if her very presence demanded his attention. "You've made a grave mistake," she said, her voice carrying an unnatural echo. The words sent a shiver down James' spine. "What do you mean?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He had to force himself to speak, to push through the paralyzing fear. She turned her gaze to him, her glowing eyes locking onto his. "You disturbed my slumber. Now, the chain of events has begun. They will come." "Who will come?" Emma blurted out, her voice shaky. The beam tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. "The parasite," she said finally. "The force that devours worlds. They follow me. They always follow." The room fell silent. No one knew what to say. The hum, faint but persistent, seemed to grow louder again, resonating through their bones. Before anyone could ask another question, the beam turned her attention to the crystal orb she still held. It pulsed faintly, casting flickering green light across the chamber walls. She whispered something in a language no one understood, and the orb emitted a low vibration that seemed to ripple through the air. "What is that thing?" James asked, stepping closer despite himself. The beam didn't look at him. "A fragment of my world," she said. "A memory. And a weapon." James frowned. "A weapon? Against what?" Her gaze snapped back to him. And for the first time, there was something in her expression. Fear. Against them. But it is not enough. Not alone. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled. Dust rained from the chamber ceiling as the vibrations grew stronger. The lights flickered again, and a deep, guttural sound echoed from somewhere far away. It was a sound no human should ever hear, a sound that didn't belong on Earth. "What is that?" Emma whispered, clutching James' arm. The being didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward, her presence commanding. "They are here," she said simply. The words sent a wave of panic through the team. Some began to back away toward the exit, but James stayed rooted to the spot. He looked at the being, at the crystal orb in her hands, and then at the carvings on the walls. The warnings they had ignored were now screaming at him in the back of his mind. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice trembling. The being studied him for a moment, then extended the orb toward him. "You must take this," she said. "It will bond with you. It will give you a chance to survive." James hesitated. The orb pulsed in her hands, its glow intensifying. He could feel its energy from where he stood, a strange, magnetic pull that made his chest tighten. "What do you mean, bond?" he asked, his voice shaking. "There is no time to explain," she said sharply. "If you do not take it, you will die. They will kill you all." The ground shook again, harder this time. The strange sound grew louder, closer. James glanced at Emma, then at the rest of the team. Their fear mirrored his own, but he knew he had no choice. He reached out and took the orb. The moment his fingers touched its surface, a searing pain shot through his body. He cried out, collapsing to his knees as the orb's light consumed him. His vision blurred, his mind flooded with images, alien landscapes, vast cities of shimmering crystal, and endless, shadowy creatures devouring everything in their path. He felt the being's voice in his head, calm and steady. Do not resist. Let it merge with you. And then, just as quickly as it began, the pain stopped. James opened his eyes, gasping for breath. The orb was gone, its energy now coursing through his veins. He could feel it, a strange alien power humming beneath his skin. "What did you do to me?" he asked, his voice shaking. "I gave you a fighting chance," the being said. Before anyone could respond, the chamber walls cracked, and a deafening roar echoed through the desert. Something massive was coming, something that made the air itself feel heavy. The being turned toward the entrance of the chamber, her glowing eyes narrowing. "It begins now," she said. James staggered to his feet, his body trembling with the weight of what had just happened. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew one thing for certain. Their discovery had unleashed something far worse than they could have ever imagined. The connection. The desert night was cold, a sharp contrast to the scorching heat of the day. The camp was eerily quiet, except for the faint hum that seemed to radiate from James himself. He sat on the edge of his cot, staring at his trembling hands. The power of the orb, the thing now inside him, buzzed beneath his skin, alive and restless. Emma cautiously stepped into the tent. She looked at James with a mix of fear and concern. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James didn't respond immediately. He couldn't find the words to explain what he was feeling. His mind was flooded with flashes of alien memories, cities that floated above oceans of liquid light, creatures with crystalline bodies communicating through thought alone, and a sky filled with stars that no human had ever seen. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "It's like I can feel everything, hear everything." Emma hesitated before sitting across from him. "What does that mean?" James shook his head, pressing his palms to his temples. "I don't know. It's like this thing, this orb. It's changing me." Before Emma could respond, a sharp metallic sound cut through the silence. It wasn't loud, but it was unnerving, like nails scraping against steel. Both of them froze. "What was that?" Emma whispered, her face pale. James stood, the hum in his body growing stronger, almost as if it were reacting to the sound. "Stay here," he said, though his voice carried no confidence. He stepped out of the tent, the cold desert air biting his skin. The camp was bathed in moonlight, the dunes casting long, eerie shadows. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Then he saw it, movement in the distance. A figure was standing just beyond the camp's perimeter. It was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements too smooth, like it was gliding rather than walking. Its eyes glowed faintly green, the same eerie light as the orb. "James." Emma's voice trembled from behind him. She had followed, unable to stay put. The figure took a step closer, and that scraping sound filled the air again. James felt the hum in his chest intensify, almost like a warning. He instinctively raised his hand, and to his shock, a faint green light flickered in his palm. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if studying him. Then, without warning, it let out a guttural, otherworldly shriek that echoed across the camp. Emma screamed, but James didn't flinch. The light in his hand grew stronger, forming a small glowing sphere. He didn't know what he was doing, but it felt natural, like he'd done it 1,000 times before. "Stay behind me," he told Emma, his voice steadied despite the fear coursing through him. The creature lunged forward, its movements impossibly fast. James thrust his hand out, and the glowing sphere shot forward, hitting the creature square in the chest. It let out a horrific screech as its body convulsed, then collapsed into a heap of ash. James stared at his hand, the light now gone. His heart raced, his breath shallow. What the hell is happening to me? Before Emma could respond, a voice echoed in his mind. It was her voice, the being they had awakened. "You are the bridge," the voice said, calm and steady, "the link between what was and what will be." James closed his eyes, gripping his head. "Get out of my head," he shouted, but the voice didn't stop. "You carry my memories now," she continued. "My power, my purpose. You are the only one who can stand against them." "Against who?" James demanded, his voice rising. The voice grew softer, almost mournful. "The parasite, the force that destroyed my world. It has followed me here, and now it will destroy yours." Emma placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "James, you're scaring me. Who are you talking to?" James opened his eyes, his expression haunted. "Her," he said. "She's in my head. She's showing me things I don't want to see." Emma frowned. "What things?" "Destruction," James whispered. "Worlds turned to ash. Civilizations wiped out. It's like she's trying to prepare me for something." A sudden scream pierced the air, cutting their conversation short. It came from the far end of the camp. James and Emma exchanged a glance before running toward the sound. When they arrived, they found one of their team members, Carl, standing in the middle of the dig site. His eyes glowed green, and his body twitched unnaturally, like a puppet on invisible strings. "Carl," Emma called out, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned toward them, his face devoid of emotion. In a voice that wasn't his own, he said, "You cannot stop it. You cannot escape." James felt the hum in his chest surge again, the green light flickering in his hands. He stepped forward, his fear replaced by something else. Determination. "I don't know what you are," James said, his voice steady, "but you're not taking this planet." Carl, or whatever was controlling him, let out a low, guttural laugh. "This is only the beginning," it said. James clenched his fists, the light in his palms growing brighter. "Then let's end it before it starts." The threat revealed. The dig site was unrecognizable. What was once a quiet camp of discovery now looked like a battlefield frozen in the eerie glow of green light. The air was thick with tension, and the whispers of something unnatural seemed to echo from the sand itself. James stood at the center of it all, his hands trembling, the faint hum within him now a steady thrum. Around him, his team was no longer his team. Carl was the first, but he wasn't the last. One by one, they succumbed to whatever force had awakened alongside the ancient being. Their eyes glowed green, their movements jerky, almost insect-like, as if their bodies were no longer theirs. James could feel it. The parasite. It wasn't just infecting their bodies. It was consuming them from the inside, replacing their humanity with something alien and cold. "How do I stop this?" James whispered, though he knew the answer wouldn't come from himself. The voice in his head responded, calm and steady as ever. "You cannot save them. They are gone. Focus on the living." James clenched his fists. "That's not good enough." Emma, one of the few who hadn't been infected yet, clung to his side. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. "James," she said, her voice shaking, "we can't stay here. We need to run." James shook his head. "We can't outrun this. If we leave, it'll follow us. We have to end it here." Before Emma could argue, a low, guttural growl echoed through the camp. One of the infected, Carl, stepped forward, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His lips moved, but the voice that came out was deep and distorted, like multiple voices speaking at once. "You are wasting time, host," the voice said, addressing James directly. James froze. "Host? What are you talking about?" The infected Carl laughed, a hollow grating sound. "You carry her power, but you do not understand it. You are a child playing with fire." James stepped forward, the hum inside him growing stronger. He didn't know how to use this power, but he could feel it responding to his anger, his fear. "If I'm the fire," he said, his voice steady, "then you're about to get burned." The infected lunged at him with inhuman speed, but James reacted instinctively. His hands lit up with green energy, and with a swift motion, he unleashed a burst of light that sent Carl flying backward. The other infected began to stir, their bodies twitching unnaturally as they turned toward James. Emma grabbed his arm. "James, there are too many of them." The voice in his head interrupted. "The artifact. It is your only hope. Use it now, or all is lost." James glanced at the crystal orb embedded in his chest, a part of him now, pulsating faintly. "How?" he asked aloud, desperation in his voice. "Focus," the voice said. "Channel its energy. Let it guide you." The infected charged as James closed his eyes, his heart pounding. He could feel the orb's power coursing through him, raw and untamed. It was overwhelming, like trying to hold back a tidal wave with his bare hands. "James!" Emma screamed as one of the infected lunged at her. James snapped his eyes open, and the world seemed to slow. He raised his hand, and a shockwave of green light erupted from his body, sending the infected flying in all directions. The ground shook, and a deep crack split the earth beneath them, swallowing several of the infected whole. Emma stared at him, wide-eyed. What are you?" James didn't answer. He didn't know. But the moment of triumph was short-lived. The ground trembled again, harder this time, and a deafening roar echoed from the horizon. James turned toward the sound, and his blood ran cold. A massive shadow loomed in the distance, crawling toward the camp like a living storm. It wasn't just one creature. It was thousands, maybe millions, all moving as one. Their bodies were a writhing mass of black and green, their eyes glowing with the same eerie light as the infected. The parasite had arrived. The voice in James' head spoke again, urgency replacing its usual calm. "You are not ready to face them. You must retreat." James clenched his fists. "If we run, they'll spread. How do I stop them?" "There is a device buried beneath the chamber," the voice said. "A relic of my world. It is designed to contain them, but it requires a wielder, one who can harness its power. You must find it." James glanced at Emma. She was terrified, but she nodded. "Whatever you need to do, I'm with you." With no time to lose, James and Emma ran toward the chamber, dodging the infected as they moved. The ground continued to shake, and the roars of the parasite grew louder, closer. When they reached the chamber, James could feel the relic's presence, a faint vibration in the air. He placed his hand on the wall, and the carvings began to glow, revealing the hidden passage that led deeper underground. "This is it," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Emma hesitated. "Are you sure about this?" James nodded. "We don't have a choice." As they descended into the passage, the infected swarmed the entrance, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. James turned back, the green light in his hands flaring to life. "Go," he said to Emma. "I'll hold them off." Emma hesitated for a moment before nodding and running deeper into the passage. James faced the oncoming horde, the hum in his chest now a roar. He didn't know if he could stop them, but he was determined to try. The mission. The hidden passage spiraled downward, the air growing colder with every step. The glow from the carvings on the walls was the only source of light, casting long, shifting shadows as Emma led the way. Behind her, James stayed close, his hands glowing faintly green, ready for anything. The roar of the parasite above ground was muffled now, but they could still feel the vibrations through the stone. It was relentless, a force of destruction pressing closer with every passing second. "What is this place?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James scanned the intricate carvings, their meaning somehow clear to him now. The orb's presence in his chest seemed to translate the ancient language effortlessly. "It's a vault," he said, almost to himself. A weapon built to stop the parasite. At least, that's what she told me. Emma glanced back at him. And you trust her? That thing in your head? James hesitated. He didn't trust her completely, but what choice did he have? She's the only reason we're still alive, he said finally. The passage opened into a massive underground chamber, its ceiling so high it vanished into darkness. In the center of the room stood a towering structure, like an obelisk, but its surface was smooth and black, reflecting the green glow from James' hands. Strange patterns pulsed across it, alive and moving, like a heartbeat. That's it, James said, stepping forward. He could feel the energy emanating from the obelisk, calling to him. Emma grabbed his arm. Wait, what if this is a trap? It's not, James said with quiet certainty. He placed a hand on the obelisk, and the entire chamber lit up, the patterns on the walls glowing brighter. The hum in his chest synced with the rhythm of the obelisk, and he felt a connection, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. A voice echoed in his mind. Her voice. You have found the containment core. It is the last hope for your world. James gritted his teeth. How does it work? It requires a conduit, she replied, a host to channel its power. But be warned, the process will change you. You will no longer be human. James froze. He looked at Emma, who stared at him, wide-eyed. What does that mean? She asked, her voice trembling. James didn't answer. He already knew. The orb had already begun changing him. He could feel it in his bones, his mind. He wasn't the same man who had started this dig. The voice spoke again. If you do not activate the core, the parasite will consume everything. Your planet will fall, as mine did. James clenched his fists. And if I do this, what happens to me? You will become something more, the voice said, but you will no longer belong to this world. Emma grabbed his hand, her grip firm. James, there has to be another way. You don't have to do this. James looked at her, his expression heavy with the weight of the decision. If I don't, there won't be anything left of this world to save. Before Emma could protest, the ground above them shook violently. Dust and debris rained down as the roars of the parasite grew louder. They were running out of time. James turned back to the obelisk, placing both hands on its surface. The green light from his hands spread across the structure, and the patterns began to shift, forming intricate alien symbols. The voice in his head grew louder. Brace yourself, James Carter. This will not be painless. A surge of energy shot through him, and he cried out as his body was enveloped in light. The pain was indescribable, as if every cell in his body was being torn apart and reassembled. He fell to his knees, his vision blurring as the energy from the obelisk flooded into him. James, Emma shouted, rushing to his side. He looked up at her, his eyes now glowing brighter than ever. Stay back, he managed to say, his voice distorted, as if two voices were speaking at once. The obelisk pulsed one final time, and the light dimmed. James stood, unsteady but transformed. His body emitted a faint green aura, and the hum in his chest was now a roar, resonating through the chamber. What are you now? Emma asked, her voice barely audible. James turned to face her, his expression unreadable. The only chance we have, he said. Before they could say anything more, the parasite broke through. The infected swarmed into the chamber, their glowing eyes fixated on James. Emma backed away, terrified, but James stepped forward. He raised his hand, and a wave of energy erupted from him, slamming into the infected and disintegrating them instantly. The parasite let out a deafening roar, and James felt its presence, vast and overwhelming, pressing down on him. But he didn't falter. The core's power flowed through him now, and for the first time, he felt ready. Get out of here, he told Emma, his voice calm but firm. What about you? She asked, tears streaming down her face. I'll hold them off, James said, his glowing eyes locked on the horde. Go. Now. Emma hesitated, but she knew there was no arguing with him. She turned and ran, her heart breaking with every step. James faced the parasite, his hands glowing brighter as the power within him surged. "You wanted me," he said, his voice steady. "Come and get me." With that, he unleashed the full force of the core, the chamber erupting in a blinding light as the battle for humanity's survival began. Sacrifice and revelation. The chamber trembled violently as the wave of energy from James blasted through the swarm of infected. The parasite roared in rage, its voice an unearthly blend of growls and screeches that made the air itself shudder. But James didn't back down. His body glowed with an intensity that was no longer human, his every move guided by the ancient power of the core. Above ground, Emma ran through the collapsing ruins of the camp, tears streaking her face. The screams of the infected echoed behind her, but she couldn't look back. She didn't want to see James facing them alone. She didn't want to accept the thought that she might never see him again. As she reached the edge of the excavation site, she stopped and turned, her heart pounding. The ground beneath the camp cracked and shifted, glowing veins of green light spreading out like roots. The parasite was vast, its reach far greater than she had imagined. Deep below, James stood in the center of the chaos. The obelisk pulsed behind him, sending waves of energy through his body, amplifying his power. He could feel the parasite's presence pressing against his mind, testing him, trying to break him. "You are strong, host," the parasite hissed, its voice a mix of mockery and malice. "But you cannot stop us. We are endless. We are inevitable." James clenched his fists, his glowing eyes narrowing. "You're wrong," he said, his voice steady but alien, layered with the echoes of the being inside him. "You've been stopped before. That's why this core exists." The parasite let out a guttural laugh. "And what did it cost them? What will it cost you?" James hesitated. The parasite's words struck a nerve. He could feel the truth buried in the memories the core had given him. The civilization that had created this weapon, Nera's people, had paid the ultimate price to contain the parasite. They had sacrificed everything. The voice of the ancient being, Nera, spoke in his mind again. "It is true, James. My people could not stop the parasite without great loss. But you are different. You are human. You have the strength to endure what we could not." James shook his head. "I don't feel strong. I feel broken." "Broken things can be reforged," Nera said, "but only if you are willing to sacrifice." The parasite surged forward, its infected swarming the chamber like a tide of darkness. James raised his hands, releasing another wave of energy that obliterated the nearest attackers. But the strain was starting to show. His body ached, his mind teetered on the edge of collapse. He knew Nera was right. He couldn't win this fight without giving something up. As the parasite's main mass pushed into the chamber, a monstrous form began to emerge from the shadows. It was a towering, grotesque amalgamation of writhing limbs and glowing green eyes. The parasite's core. James felt its presence, overwhelming and suffocating. It wasn't just a creature. It was a hive mind, a consciousness as old as the stars, filled with nothing but hunger. Nera's voice was soft now, almost mournful. "The core can destroy it, but it will require all of your energy. All of you." James closed his eyes, the weight of her words settling over him. He thought of Emma, of the team he had lost, of the world above that had no idea what was happening beneath its surface. He opened his eyes, the glow brighter than ever. "Tell me what I have to do." Nera hesitated. "You will not survive this, James, but your world will." James nodded. "Then let's end this." The parasite roared, its massive form lunging toward him. James stepped forward, the core's energy surging through him. He extended his arms, and the obelisk behind him responded, its light intensifying until it was blinding. Emma, standing at the edge of the excavation, saw the green light erupt from the ground. shooting into the sky like a beacon. The roar of the parasite reached a deafening pitch, then abruptly stopped. In the chamber, James stood at the center of the light, his body disintegrating as the core's power consumed him. The parasite's core writhed and shrieked, its mass dissolving into ash as the energy tore through it. James felt a strange peace as the light enveloped him. He heard Nara's voice one last time. "You are more than human, James Carter. You are a savior." And then there was silence. Above ground, the green light faded, leaving nothing but stillness. Emma stared at the ruins of the camp, tears streaming down her face. She knew James was gone, but the world was safe. As the first rays of dawn broke over the desert, Emma felt a strange warmth in her chest. She placed a hand over her heart and realized the faint hum of the core still resonated, as if a part of James lived on. The parasite was gone, but its memory and James' sacrifice would never be forgotten. The fight for survival. The desert was silent. For the first time in hours, the roaring, screeching chaos of the parasite was gone. Only the faint hum of the aftermath lingered, a soft vibration in the air, like the world was holding its breath. Emma stood at the edge of the collapsed dig site, staring at the crater where James had made his final stand. The green glow had disappeared, but the memory of it was burned into her mind. Her chest still throbbed faintly with the echo of James' sacrifice. She didn't understand why, but she could feel it. Some part of him, of the core, still resonated within her. The thought gave her both comfort and dread. Then she saw it. On the horizon, a shadow, faint at first, but growing larger by the second. It wasn't the parasite. No, this was something else. Something deliberate. Shapes began to emerge from the shimmering desert heat, sleek, metallic ships descending from the sky. Emma's heart sank. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. The first ship landed with a deafening thud, sending waves of sand rippling outward. Emma stumbled back, shielding her face from the blast of wind. The ship was massive, its surface gleaming with an iridescent sheen, covered in symbols that looked disturbingly similar to those James had seen on the obelisk. The silence stretched unbearably as a hatch opened, releasing a hiss of pressurized air. Then they appeared, tall, humanoid figures cloaked in silver armor that shimmered like liquid. Their faces were obscured by helmets, their movements precise and calculated. Emma's instinct was to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She could only watch as one of the figures stepped forward, its gaze fixed on her. "You survived," it said, its voice smooth and cold, echoing slightly as if it were speaking through layers of static. Emma blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" The figure tilted its head, studying her. The core was activated. The parasite was contained. Yet you remain. The other figures stepped closer, their presence overwhelming. Emma took a shaky step back. "Who are you?" "We are the architects," the figure said. "The creators of the core. The guardians of the balance. And now, we are the judges of your kind." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "Judges? What are you talking about?" The architect raised a hand, and a holographic display appeared in the air, showing scenes from the battle. The parasite, the infected, and finally, James standing at the heart of the obelisk's light. "This was not your fight," the figure said. "Your species is primitive, reckless, yet you have accessed what was never meant for you." Emma's fear turned to anger. James saved this planet. He gave everything to stop that thing. The architect paused, as if considering her words. Yes, his sacrifice was unexpected. A human harnessing the core was not foreseen. It is an anomaly. Emma's chest tightened. Anomaly. He was a hero. The architect stepped closer, its towering form casting a shadow over her. Perhaps, but the activation of the core has consequences. The parasite was only one threat. Now, others will come. They will sense the energy. They will seek to claim it. Emma stared at the figure, her mind racing. Then help us. If you're the ones who created it, if you're so powerful, help us defend ourselves. The architect tilted its head again, the faintest trace of curiosity in its posture. Your kind is fragile, incomplete. Assistance would require intervention. Then intervene, Emma shouted. James didn't give his life just for you to stand here and watch us die. For a long moment, the architect said nothing. Then, it extended a hand toward her. You carry the echo of the core within you. Its resonance lingers in your form. This is unexpected. Emma instinctively stepped back. What are you talking about? The architect's hand remained outstretched. You are the seed of what comes next. If your species is to survive, you must become more. Emma shook her head. I don't understand. The architect stepped closer. You will, but it will not be without cost. Before she could protest, the architect touched her forehead with a single finger. A surge of energy shot through her, and she screamed as her vision was flooded with images, galaxies spinning, civilizations rising and falling, and a vast network of energy connecting everything in the universe. She saw James standing in the light of the core, his face calm and resolute. When the vision faded, Emma collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. She looked up at the architect, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. What did you do to me? The architect stepped back. We have given you the first spark. The rest is up to you. The ships began to rise, their engines humming with a sound that seemed to vibrate in Emma's very bones. Wait, she called out. What am I supposed to do? The architect turned, its voice echoing one final time. Survive. As the ships disappeared into the sky, Emma sat alone in the desert, the weight of their words pressing down on her. She didn't feel different, but she knew she was. She could feel the faint hum of the core, stronger now, resonating not just in her chest, but in her mind. The world was quiet again, but it wasn't the calm she had hoped for. It was the silence before the storm. Emma stood, her legs shaky but determined. James had given everything to protect this planet. Now it was her turn to finish what he started. The fight for survival wasn't over. It was just beginning.